Hello and welcome to the 19th edition of Exploring Enterprise, the podcast series from the Enterprise Research Centre. I'm Professor Mark Hart. I'm Deputy Director of the ERC, and today I'm really pleased to be joined by Emily Whitehead, who is a business coach and consultant and founder of Simply Great Britain. And joining Emily today is Professor Andrew Henley, who is Professor of Entrepreneurship and Economics at Cardiff Business School. And today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of microbusiness, microenterprises. And as far as I'm concerned, it's sometimes a group of businesses which tend to get overlooked in a lot of policy debates, economic debates. But as we all know, they are basically the majority of businesses in the private sector in the UK. So I think it's about time we devoted a podcast to exploring what does the research tell us, and also what's it like to be a microenterprise, and also the challenges that they face. So Andy, I'm going to come to you first. You've put your flag in the sand and done a lot of research on microenterprises, self-employment over the years, amongst other things as well, I should quickly add. But, Andrew's CV is there for all to see. But today we're focusing on microenterprise. So in terms of, where would you start the discussion on this group of enterprises in terms of their importance and contribution to the UK economy?
Well, I think the first thing is to actually define what a microenterprise is. And the usual definition is a business that employs between 0 and 9 employees. Now, what does it mean if you employ 0? It basically means you're a sole trader. The person who owns the business, or sometimes self-employed, sometimes set up as a limited company, doesn't employ anybody else. But a micro business can take a business up to about just under 10 employees, and that's the sort of official definition. How important are they? Well, you made the point that they are numerically very important, Mark. In fact, 89% of all businesses in the UK at the moment are micro businesses employing less than 10 people. So put a number on that. It's about just under 2.5 million micro enterprises out of about 2.7 million businesses in total. So numerically, they're very important. How important are they for the economy? Well, that's less so because remember, they don't employ many people. In fact, many of them don't employ any people. So they account for about 20% of all employment and perhaps output in the economy. But that's important. They're in a very important sector. And you mentioned self-employment. Many of them are set up as sole proprietorships, self-employed. They're not limited companies. But actually, probably in that total, around something like 80% are set up as limited companies, and the rest are registered as self-employed, so that the business will trade with a business name, may well have a business account, but it will, for purposes of sending the dreaded money to the HMRC, it will be a self-employed business in which the owner-manager pays tax and national insurance as a self-employed person, rather than paying themselves as a dividend.
So they're well under the VAT threshold for
many of them are indeed, although increasingly I think businesses are finding their way above the threshold, because the threshold hasn't really increased very much recently. And that's a bit of a problem, because once you're over the threshold, of course, it becomes a bit rather more complicated. You've got to account for all your VAT.
I mean, it was a great celebration by the raising of the VAT threshold at the budget. That was seen to be addressing the problem that many organisations like the FSB, for example, have talked about, this cliff edge where people just leave themselves just under the VAT threshold and don't want to, scale their business any further. But raising it by 5,000 doesn't seem to have addressed the problem. But with great celebration, we announced the raising of the VAT threshold anyway. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think it was intended to be a sort of a token giveaway, really, wasn't it? And it barely keeps pace with the inflation we've seen over the last 12 months to 2 years. So it's done little more than leave businesses where they were. And you're absolutely right that the problem with the VAT threshold is that it is a cliff edge, and it does stifle ambition. So you will see businesses working hard to keep themselves under it, whether it's through turning business away, or whether it's through careful accounting practice, shall we say.
There's one of my famous statistics, and you may have heard this before, that of any cohort of startups in any one year, only 2% of them, after 3 years, if they survive, and half don't, get to over $1 million turnover. So it's clearly most startups are start small, stay small. But when I looked at the median turnover of all the rest that survived, it was 49,000, which I think indicates that well below that threshold, many businesses are very comfortable. These micro businesses, self-employed or whatever, are happy operating at that level.
Yeah, 49,000. If you think about a business, even if it's just you and you haven't got a huge amount of business expense, you might be working as a freelance business-to-business consultant or something. But you're not earning very much if you're after expenses. If your turnover is only about 49,000 a year, that's right. I mean, the other big threshold problem actually is if you think about all those sole proprietors, basically the owner manager, and that's it. If they take on an employee, they've doubled the size of the business in employment terms, and that's a massive threshold problem, because once you do that, you're into the world of pay as you earn and national insurance. You've got a whole new additional to the VAT problem. You've got another threshold to get over, and a load of admin to do with HMRC, because you're going to have to send your pay as you earn returns in and pay all the national insurance, and then when the employee goes sick or whatever, you've got all of that to wade your way through. So it becomes quite complicated. So that becomes another big threshold problem, and it means that a lot of businesses don't actually ever employ people.
So we're painting a picture here which perhaps isn't reflecting the sort of area that you work in, Emily, with respect to working with micro enterprises, the work that you've done in terms of Simply Written, et cetera, et cetera. So let's hear your perspective on this group of businesses, the many millions of micro enterprises in the UK economy.
Thank you, Mark. And really good to hear Andrew's figures and data, because I think it really rings true compared to what I'm seeing on a day-to-day basis. I guess I want to start by saying that I am a micro business owner. So I've been in business some 20 years after a corporate career that didn't, how can I put this, align with a very young and new family. So I decided to work for myself, but did spend quite a lot of time feeling self-conscious about being small and micro, because I'd come from that micro environment. So in my eyes, certainly 20 years ago, I felt that proper business was size related, and therefore felt slightly, I use the word we a lot on my first website, for example, in an effort to feel bigger than I actually was. However, that has taken me into somewhat of an amazing journey into micro business as a result, because I quickly recognized that I was surrounded by people like me. And I have to say, in a corporate career, to that point, I hadn't fully appreciated. I was aware of small businesses, but hadn't fully appreciated that counted in the same way. And I don't think that I'm alone, and I still meet people who feel that way. I suppose you talked about thresholds, Andrew, and you talked about understanding what a micro enterprise is. And I often find that understanding what a micro enterprise is sometimes the first challenge. So there's a big umbrella term called small business, and we have loads of fantastic media and content out there about small business and what small business is in the UK. But actually, in some ways, that almost results in micro enterprises becoming more invisible, because they're kind of lumped together with those that have got 50 employees, for example, which is pretty big by comparison to your sole trader or your single director limited company. But in terms of how if you think about what I perceive as the distinction, quite often when I'm working with micro businesses, and I work with businesses of all sizes actually, but obviously have a big focus on micro, is that they are often working from, or often highly focused on purpose. So the why in their business is often paramount, quite often prioritized above profit or those traditional metrics that we might apply to business, straight line growth and profit first, etc. And so there feels like there is and you reflected that when you thought about VAT thresholds, for example, but that why and purpose can be related to them personally. So I so often hear stories of micro owners who have come out of corporate career like me, or a mainstream career, that could be stress, it could be family commitments, it could be that they are looking to create a working life that reflects better and aligns better with what they see. And although that doesn't mean that there aren't commercial gaps in market and entrepreneurial opportunities that they've identified, it may and often does work much better for their temperaments, learning styles, the way in which they want to live a life and work. So I do find that the motivation to exponential growth and the motivation for a much larger business reflected in your data there, Mark, about 2% in 2 years, only 2% in 2 years getting to $1 million in turnover, I don't always find is the motivation. It's often about being able to live in a particular place, to operate in a particular community, to fulfill and align to their natural skills, creativity, gaps and opportunities where they see that they can do something better than what they've experienced previously, as a way to transform. And in that sense, I use that word quite often. Microbusiness can be quite transformative, both for the founders in the way in which they work and live, but also then their communities and immediate surroundings, because they're injecting some vibrancy, they're injecting some life into their communities.
So, Emily, that's about the motivations. I'm going to sort of interrupt you there if I may. We're probably in danger of talking about micro-enterprises, micro-businesses, as if, they're this sort of homogeneous group of businesses. They're not. I mean, you're the classic corporate, fed up with corporate life. I want to do my own thing for independence. That's great. But you've got, there's a huge rate of demographics. You've got older people who are, personal wealth, taking early retirement perhaps, people who are asset poor, who have no other opportunities. You've got ethnic minority groups across the country, dozens of different ethnic groups using this as an expression of their, connection to their own community. You've got the whole gender issue playing through all of this. So the micro enterprise, the sector, this population of businesses is really, really heterogeneous in terms of its characteristics. So the question then I want to put to you, Emily, before I go back to Andrew, is what sort of challenges, you're a business coach, so when you're working with this very diverse group, is it the same challenge as a micro enterprise, or are we having to reflect a whole range of different challenges these businesses face?
So they share the same challenges as all business, cash flow, finding their customers, work, understanding markets in an ever-evolving world. But I would say the first thing, the biggest challenge I see, and you're right, micro-businesses are entirely diverse, and anything and everything you can think of in terms of a type of business and the type of person that might be running that business is as broad as you can imagine. But capacity is often the biggest issue. They are often, as Andrew already pointed out, that threshold of employing someone can seem pretty impossible for a small turnover or an unpredictable income stream. So capacity, they are often having to do everything, trying to do everything, working outside their natural skill set, possibly trying to outsource some of that work, but not perhaps being experienced in that outsourcing, or simply feeling that they have got, it is just them and they've got to keep going. And I think capacity is a huge barrier. And I see a lot of burnout, a lot of exhaustion, and a lot of spreading themselves far too thin and not focusing on the thing that creates the productivity and the success in the business.
Okay. Andrew, I want to bring you in here. I mean, the diversity, where does this point about, a whole range of different types of business? Okay, one to 9 employees, or 0 for the sole traders, etc. I mean, where do you see the importance of this diversity in the research that you've done over the years?
Well, it is very diverse. I mean, there's two ways of looking at it. I mean, it's a little tricky actually looking at the data, because if you want to know about the owner managers, you probably have to then start looking at the sort of individual level data, and it's easy to do that with the self-employed. We know a bit less about companies who are in the sort of government's company level database, although We're finding out more, actually. I mean, a project I've been involved with, the gender index, is digging into a lot of the data and managing to categorize that on the basis of gender. And that's one of the areas of imbalance. Small businesses, micro business ownership and self-employment are both rather male-dominated. It's been improving gradually over the years, but if you look, for example, at who's growing fast, it tends to be much more likely to be men-led businesses rather than women-led businesses. But that probably comes back to some of the issues that Emily has been talking about in terms of purpose. Sector is very diverse. Micro businesses are spread right across the economy. Where are they most prevalent? Well, the three sectors that are most prevalent are themselves very diverse. Construction, not surprisingly, typically men with a white van, no fixed place of work, tending to go around to one customer to the next. Wholesale, retailing, motor trade, that sort of thing. So shopkeeping, restaurants, cafes, that kind of thing are all lots and lots of micro businesses. Some doing well, some doing less well. And the other area, actually, which is a bit of a different area where we also see quite a lot of micro businesses are in the sort of professional, scientific, technical areas, which I think you can probably group together a sort of business-to-business type service activity. And it's people who probably have built up a lot of experience, maybe 20 or 30 years of employment experience, and decided they're fed up with working for grumpy boss, so they'll actually set up on their own and think they can do better. And there are a lot of those sorts of businesses, and those are the sort of businesses actually that tended to do quite well through the last few years because they tended to be a bit more resilient to the pandemic. Largely home working, they've transitioned quite well into sort of teleworking and things like that. And you pointed rightly about ethnicity. That's an important differentiator as well. Yes, certainly businesses that want to serve their local communities and the communities that they're in. But also I'd say there's a sort of a negative there, and that is that, maybe those businesses also reflect that the greater difficulty that ethnic minority community members face when trying to secure paid employment jobs. So they tend to then gravitate into setting up their own businesses or into self-employment because it's easier. And then there's the spatial angle as well. There is spatial diversity in self-employment. Actually, we see a lot of self-employment in London and the South East, and I think that reflects perhaps better market conditions.
Well, okay, thanks for that, Andrew. I mean, we're not going to probe, Emily, about your grumpy boss and corporate life, just to be clear. But I think I want to move now on and talk about growth, because it's as if these micro-enterprises are operating in important interstices in the market, but many of them don't grow. I know from my own research that's not the case. I mean, looking at this piece of work I've done tracking micro-enterprise 1 to 4 employees over 13, 14 years. And there was a group of about 2,000 of them out of about 250,000 who actually ended up employing on average 63 people and having a turnover of 8.6 million. So growth can come from this sector. Not every business wants to grow. You've already explained why, Emily. But let's turn this into a conversation about growth, because I want to talk about what not just their impact, footprint in the economy, but what can they contribute as we seek to get back onto a growth track in the UK economy. What are the things that we need to be paying attention to? And let me share your experiences, Emily, about the businesses, micro enterprises who have grown. What's been the biggest driver behind them?
So I agree. I'm not trying to characterize micro enterprises as just staying small and cute somewhere. I think that growth can and does happen. I think one of the most important factors is consistent and universal business support that's of good quality. I hear time and time again, I've done work with Aston University and other universities, been part of projects, and where great quality business support happens, good coaching and good mentoring happens, facilitate those original founders who may be going from naught, going from themselves and growing a business, really helps them take those big decisions and make those step changes into a growth environment. And I think where there is absence of that support, where there is absence of mentoring maybe, or even peer networks, that's where additional caution lands. So if you imagine some of those barriers that we talked about, or thresholds at least around employing or around that threshold potentially, that can quite quickly become a fear or a concern instead of being around people who say, no, this leap can happen and it happens like this, and where there are good examples, where there's some hand-holding and quality support. And I think that that's not to be negative, because I think it's hugely positive and you can see the impact it has, but it is at the moment sporadic and often hasn't traditionally been, certainly in terms of a funded structure, hasn't always been applied to those micro businesses. Okay. Because perhaps there's been an assumption that they won't grow. I don't know. Maybe Andrew has data.
Look, I want to come on to that because we're going to end up here in a discussion about policy. But Andrew, your view on growth of these micro enterprises, what's your take on all of that?
Well, I share a lot of Emily's views on this, and certainly from my own experience over the years of working with small businesses. I mean, we see some pathologies, if I can put it like that. The sort of lack of focus or inability or lack of time really to focus on strategic thinking. Small business owners often find themselves just focused on the day-to-day grind, the fighting fires, the stuff that just keeps coming at them. If they do employ people, often delegation skills could be better. I mean, it's my business. It's not yours, and I'm really heavily invested in it. So every time I delegate a task, I then want to go and pick pull the plant out and check it's growing. And then I think also, and I've seen this quite a lot, and this is where actually the networking and the support, mentoring support really comes into play, is this sense of isolation. I'm the only person who really is experiencing this problem with my business. There's nobody else like me out there. There are actually lots of people like you out there. And if we can just connect you together, you can really start to support each other. It's about sharing knowledge, unlocking, the stuff that one person knows that actually the other person is trying to solve. And because it's peer-to-peer, often that information is then trusted and well regarded, rather than, some professor like you or me, Mark, standing at the front and telling them how to run their businesses. That kind of information often gets discounted. If they hear it from a fellow small business owner who's going through the same mill, then they will really value it.
That's why I bring Emily into the room to work with me.
So what are the kind of growth drivers then? Yeah, it's around things like the literature here suggests that capabilities, skills, resources are important. I might touch a bit on the housing market actually if we ever get a chance, but the business environment itself is important. Are there good conditions for making it, helping you to make a success of your business in the area that you're in or in the market that you're trying to operate in? But I think also really important is this sense of vision and purpose, and allied to that is there a growth ambition there? And if there is growth ambition, then you will see the kind of success that you've been talking about. But we need to see more businesses achieving that level of success to achieve a bigger impact in the economy. We do know that the evidence suggests, I should say, that if you put businesses through these kind of developmental support programs, whether it's a sort of an extended leadership program or whether it's peer-to-peer mentoring, guide on the side stuff, then actually there are probably going to be sustained and sustainable improvements in productivity and growth. Even just the short-term business advice intervention will often have, for certain types of advice, will have a kind of a boost on productivity, but it might be a bit more short-term.
And for our listeners, Andrew has very kindly submitted a report on that very topic, which is available on the ERC website, enterpriseresearch.ac.uk, if you want to have a longer read at that, because the evidence is important. Which brings me on to this question. If we're saying that these millions of micro enterprises are important to our communities, important to, basically in every village and market town across the UK, why do they sometimes get ignored? And one of the biggest events that we saw was the pandemic, when there was a huge cry about the number of these businesses that were excluded from the support. Obviously, furlough, if you're a sole trader, forget it. If you're a recently established self-employed person, forget it. If you're a woman returning from maternity leave as a sole trader, forget it. And that speaks to me that there's a blind spot in terms of policy. I know that people talk about the 3 million excluded. My own calculations suggest it's probably around about 1 million. But hey, 1 million individuals is not a small number. And therefore, that they still feel aggrieved that government did not step in and help them through the most challenging time that this whole economy and society has ever faced. So why is it does government have a blind spot? Is it just too difficult to comprehend all these issues that we've been talking about? Emily, back to you, and I'll give Andrew a chance to respond.
I think my experience, and this is, this government, a government, I think that do I use that word? Yeah, I think we have worshipped at the feet of large business, which is great, employs a lot of people, great productivity, contributes heavily to the UK economy. And we have used language and had media representation about what good business looks like, and that is often size related. And so naturally, if you are a policymaker and you want to make the biggest impact with the smallest amount of resource, then you are going to front load that support to those businesses that you feel have got the best chance to grow into something really big. And that's fine. I can see the sense in that. However, if we think about the other metrics around smaller businesses, yes, they might grow, and they may and should and could contribute more to the economy and grow and employ people, and we can give them those opportunities. But if we look at other metrics about that contribution to community, about that opportunity to provide employment for people who haven't necessarily found employment easy or accessible in other arenas, to use their skills in a really creative and out-of-the-box way that they haven't found that elbow room within a larger organisation themselves, then we can see that focusing in on those micro businesses and giving them the same tools and the same interventions and support could have a huge impact on the UK as a whole. I think there is a blind spot. I also think there's a language blind spot as well. We talk, as I mentioned earlier, about this kind of small business, but it's a huge umbrella term. If you do a Google about, the kind of traffic around small business compared to micros, micro is being talked about by a very small handful of people. So in this country, we kind of lump together small and don't necessarily understand the very different working conditions of a micro enterprise compared to that business up the road with 10 employees, which is relatively, or 50 employees, which is relatively large. And so I think we need some representation in the media. We need to perhaps, and this is my own personal thing, get the language right and name people as they are. You are a micro business, and you therefore are identified, showcased, seen in mainstream media as that valuable, but also with a very specific set of needs around support requirements.
So, Emily, do you feel actually the term self-employment's a problem? Do you think then we should say that the self-employed should really be better described as micro-businesses?
Language is really difficult because we use a lot of different language in this country. And I would personally think that if we could categorize it very clearly, as you academics do, micro is 0 to 9, yes. Small is 10 to 50, so that everybody is using that language and understanding that. And therefore, those policymakers may more readily understand the impact of applying different policy decisions to different groups and sizes of businesses.
Sorry, Emily, I just want to come down to about this blind spot in terms of support, that we tend to gravitate away from the very smallest micro businesses, the 1 to 4 employee slot. What's your perspective? Why is that? Why is there this blind spot when we're actually saying, that the Help to Grow management program is 5 employees plus? And that was a government decision deliberately to exclude.
And it is And the blind spot is very real, because if you look at the data since the pandemic, since 2019, the numbers of micro businesses have flatlined in the UK. They'd been growing really, well over the previous 10 years. Same with the self-employed's worse. We lost 600,000 self-employed people during the pandemic, and they've not come back at the moment.
Well, I'm all about the blind spot. Then having really serious consequences.
So I think there's a number of problems here. First of all, is those bits of government. I mean, in my case, it's business support is devolved here in Wales, and so it's a devolved responsibility of the Welsh government. I've been involved in an advisory panel over the last couple of years on the reshaping of business support in the sort of post-Brexit landscape. The challenge is, how do you reach such a large number of businesses? Do you just spread the jam extremely thinly? On how do you focus support on a very small proportion of those businesses who might have growth potential? And in practice, what support agencies do is they kind of stick a load of stuff online and they provide a lot of sort of information, but actually then they probably do offer only a limited number of places on their accelerated growth programs and programs like Help to Grow, which of course is funded from central government. But so there's the problem of how you scale up support itself, given the sheer numbers of businesses, and then on top of that, there's a kind of a demand side problem in that actually I think I've encountered over the years a considerable reluctance on the part of micro businesses to engage with support activity, partly around this issue of trust, but also I think around the issue of expense and cost. So if it's not heavily publicly supported, as for example Help to Grow management program is, not albeit that doesn't actually help you if you're only at 3 or 4 employees. It's expensive. So forking out £7,000, £8,000 to take part in a 9-month program or 6-month program looks like a huge amount of money, particularly when you don't really know whether it's actually going to benefit you or not. So there's quite a challenge in there in terms of persuading.
No, I was just going to say that we're recording this in mid-April 2024, and I think the department responsible for Help to Grow management is launching very soon what they call an online management essentials program, 17 videos for all businesses, all sizes, self-employed, whoever, and that comes out of the recognition that Help to Grow management perhaps had that blind spot of you missing out on the less than 5 employee businesses and indeed the self-employed. So that's launching, and my colleague Paula Whitehouse at Aston has been responsible for that, developing that curriculum. But it's a way of saying, look, that's coming out, but that's going to probably get lost in the midst of other online support from NatWest, from all the high street banks, from what the Welsh Government's up to, what the Scottish Enterprise is up to, and South of Scotland Enterprise, Howes and Islands, and then go succeed in Northern Ireland. So there's a lot out there in terms of this whole spectrum. But I mean, I'm coming to the end of our time today, but I'm keen to say, look, what would be, we are in an election year, and sometimes we want to forget about it, to be honest, but we are in an election year. What would your big ask be of all the parties in terms of critical things that they need to do in their manifesto, that when they come and go, the first 100 days, what would they be doing for micro businesses? Emily, I'll give you first go with that.
Yikes. I think for me, and I hear what Andrew's saying about spreading the jam very, very thinly, and I understand that our funding structures have meant that those larger businesses have had the biggest slice of the cake in terms of business support. But for me, I would like to see opportunities, hubs, funding through chambers, growth hubs or universities, funding that brings together micro businesses into one place. So whether you call it a hub, a co-working space, an incubator space, somewhere where they're actually coming together to maybe, I love the idea of online support for those 0 to 4s. Fantastic. That Help to Grow extension. And that's all really useful. But I think the real golden nugget in and amongst all that is when micros get together and they can share experiences, share knowledge. Absolutely, as you talked about in the research that bears that out. When I see that happen in businesses of all sizes, that's when the magic happens, if you like. So I would say create funding structures that allow those delivery partners in all areas of the UK to have an equitable, funded opportunity to create hubs where micro businesses can come together and share experiences and get help. And not in a postcode lottery way, absolutely.
Well, we've had conversations about business support and the operational chaos, as I describe it at the moment, the Shared Prosperity Fund, Cliff Age in March 25, all of that. Mm-hmm. But I'm just wondering, is this, should my taxpayers' money be spent on that? Where's the role of the private sector in here? Well, I leave that question sort of hanging in their discussions, but I'd like to come to you, Andrew. I'll give you a final word on that, Emily, in a moment. Government policy, manifesto time, what do you want to see that would make a real difference?
Okay, I was going to pick up on the private sector point because I was also going to say, I think that large businesses have a responsibility to ensure that the small businesses in their supply chains are well supported. And we see, we at Cardiff Business School have worked with a big logistics company over the years, and we see that when that works well, it can be really supportive of the small business sector. So there is. It's not just government. I think a government can perhaps, encourage some of these key anchor companies to do more to support the small businesses and give them, access to supply chains. Finance is also important, and I think we're starting to see some shift on that. But small businesses and micro businesses in particular need access to attractive, patient finance to help them invest in the things that they need to invest in. And I would probably say that needs to be, that's important, for example, for helping them to achieve things like the net zero transition, to take advantage of digital technologies. Mm. But I think allying that to, business support and saying that what we're going to do is not only alongside providing you with finance, we're also going to provide you with the coaching and mentoring or the networking support that goes with that. The trouble is this just does cost money. Some of it costs money, and we're in a world in which government ain't got any money. And so there's a chicken and egg problem, because the reason government hasn't got any money is because the economy isn't growing, businesses aren't thriving at the moment. Yeah. But how do we solve that one?
It's a bit of a conundrum going forward, and I suppose that despite the obvious point that 2-3 million micro businesses are voters, it's hard to get them in one room, where it's easy to get larger small businesses, medium-sized businesses in one room and listen. And therefore, there's many diverse. That we say micro businesses are diverse, but there's many diverse voices. Business organizations like FSB and BCC do their best. Emily, I'm going to give you the final word before I sum up.
Yes, I think that we have to remember that in business, we are working in an ecosystem of business. And so where that funding comes from is for perhaps those with much bigger brains and ambitions than I. But I think if we can create and understand, whether we call it as being part of a supply chain or whether we understand that those global pressures that we're all under, both financial and from a net zero point of view, from a sustainability point of view, there is a lot of knowledge to be shared. There's a lot of creativity and knowledge from micro businesses that can be applied or adopted or embraced by larger business, and equally that mentoring coming from larger business and those founders who have climbed the ladder, if you want to call it that, and are able to give back. I think if we can create that kind of ecosystem and include the private sector, and if that makes the funding work well, then I'm all for that. I think we have to understand that we are in an ecosystem, and if we can create something that's circular, that feeds all those different sizes of business, both large and small and micro, then I think that would lead to much more productivity and much more success. And as you say, they're voters. Micro businesses are voters, but they're also potentially those much larger businesses of the future.
Emily, thanks for that. So I'm going to bring this podcast to a conclusion. We've had a conversation around micro businesses, which huge topic. I'm not sure we've done it full justice in the last 35 minutes or so. However, what we've really understood is that they are a complete important lifeline in terms of many local communities and individuals and households throughout our society and economy. Too often, though, they are ignored and dismissed. Maybe there's too many of them to really think about what we can potentially do for them, but that's no excuse. I think we all agree on that. So I would like to thank Andy and Emily for a really interesting conversation today. I'm sure this discussion has really helped other people either stamp their feet, bang the table in terms of you really have missed out this point for a point. But I think in terms of our conversation about microbusinesses, it's something that we at the Enterprise Research Centre hold dear to our hearts. We've done many research projects on this, and we've worked with Emily in the classroom. We've worked with Andrew in terms of our research agenda. So thank you all for listening to this podcast. If you've enjoyed it and are interested in finding out more about the ERC's work, you heard me mention earlier, the website is www.enterpriseresearch.ac.uk. Thanks for listening.